Welcome back to the No Morning Show here on TTT. I am Natalie Lagore. Right now, we have on Zoom with us this morning Queen's Counsel Anand Beharrylal, who is here to talk to us about what has been happening with the 6-6 THA deadlock. We had an election on the 25th of January, and since then, really, what really has been happening in Tobago? We have assemblymen sworn in, but the business of Tobago seems to be on pause because we don't just know how to break this deadlock. Good morning to you, Queen's Counsel Beharrylal.
Good morning, Natalie. How are you?
I am fantastic, and how are you this morning?
I'm very well. I'm very well. I think I'm 4 hours ahead. So it's still morning here as well. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So talk to us, Queen's Counsel. I know that as a Trinbagonian, you have been paying attention to what's happening here in Trinidad and Tobago. We saw the election. Everybody knows the election went by, but now we're trying to figure out how to move forward. Now, the latest, I don't know if you were able to see what happened last night, is that the People's Democratic Patriots and what's new, they have offered a deal, so to speak, to the People's National Movement to say, okay, let's see if we can do a power sharing arrangement. Do you think that's something that can work? Give the chief secretary to one party, the deputy chief secretary to another party, and the presiding officer to one party, the deputy presiding officer to another party. Is this feasible in the long run?
Well, the short answer is that if consensus can be reached, then it is feasible, because there's nothing that is unlawful about power sharing if people can agree, even within let's say one party had got an outright majority. There may have been differing views within the party, and so you would have to accommodate those differing views in the appointments you would make. I think what's probably being overlooked is that from a legal perspective, although there is a deadlock, it is open to people to break that deadlock by coming to a compromise, and the one that you've just mentioned is a possibility.
Yeah.
The question, however, is whether they can really come to that consensus, whether both parties will agree to that, to share power, to use the phrase power sharing. And I think that what's worthwhile remembering is that when you actually look at what democracy is, democracy has always been understood in the modern age, whether it's America, the United Kingdom, Trinidad and Tobago, as which party you may vote for. But the reality is that democracy has never been about party politics. It's been about one person electing a representative, and that representative speaks for them in the parliament or the local assembly or whatever it happens to be. And so there's nothing wrong with power sharing. Arguably, party politics has created some sort of distortion to democracy across the world, because if you don't side with one party, then you must side with another. You can't stand as an independent, and so on. And I recall that very recently, you may have seen that Dr. Maria Dillon-Remy, who's one of the independent senators in Tobago, and as I understand it, is a born Tobagonian herself, has actually looked at this from both perspectives, or the political perspectives, and said, look, this is an opportunity for Tobagonians who are aspiring to self-government to show that they can broker deals with each other and come to a compromise without forcing what in some respects is the trauma of another election on the people of Tobago.
You know, Queen's Counsel...
The answer is yes, it's possible.
Yeah. The reality is that for Tobago, I think the best bet for the Tobagonian people is if the politicians involved could really come together on behalf of the people. But politics somehow has never really worked like that. So the question then becomes, in terms of legal options, one of the things that I've heard from the United National Congress is that there are standing orders in place in the House of Representatives to treat with the deadlock. Even though the THA standing orders don't specifically deal with this issue, but it says in the absence of the THA standing orders treating with it and the law treating with it, then you revert to the House of Representatives, the standing orders. But do you also share that view that the House of Representatives standing orders could be applied to treat with the deadlock legally?
Well, the question is what these standing orders actually say. It is very common in most democratic systems and parliamentary systems to have what we call a safety provision, so that if within the rules there is a lacuna that doesn't deal with a particular situation that arises, you can have regard to overarching rules which may apply in the national parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. So if there is provision for a lacuna to be addressed in that way, then the answer is yes, you can have regard to the standing orders in the House. But it's not a preferable position. It is still better if the Tobago House of Assembly and the assembly persons who have been elected can operate within the rules that apply to the Tobago House of Assembly, rather than have to resort to standing orders of the National Parliament.
And what do you make of the move by the government to go back to the Parliament, make changes to the THA Act so that going forward, if they should end up with a 6-6 deadlock or whatever the numbers are, once they're equal, that they would have to go back to the polls?
It's very interesting, Natalie, because we've been down this road before in Trinidad and Tobago on the national level. A lot of people forget that in 2000, there was an election in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes.
And that election resulted in a government that got a slim majority. The government then collapsed. There was another election which resulted in a hung parliament. And without changing the number of seats, approximately a year later, in 2002, the public went back to the polls and the PNM was able to secure a majority, even though the National Parliament had an even number of seats. And so what that illustrates is that, on one view, it should be that the people of Tobago are given the opportunity with their representatives to discuss with them the possibilities of resolving this without having to go back to the polls. But if that's genuinely not possible, to then have an election within approximately 12 months from the initial election. Now, I say that because although this present election resulted in a deadlock, it doesn't mean that another election held after a short period of time would also result in a deadlock. And as I say, that's illustrated by what happened in 2002 in Trinidad and Tobago, where the PNM, having initially been part of a hung parliament, were then able to secure 20 of 36 seats of the national legislature.
Yeah, but
so I think it's premature. I think it's premature to bring forward legislation now without giving a longer period of time to Tobagonians, to their representatives, to discuss matters and try to come to a resolution.
One of the changes made to the legislation is that the numbers of seats would be increased from, well, have been increased, it's just waiting for it to be proclaimed, from 12 to 15, unlike what we saw in 2000, 2001. So do you think that this is a good move? Mind you, the number 15 came out of consultations with the Tobagonian population, looking at self-autonomy for Tobago. So now we have 15 seats being debated, approved, passed in Parliament. Do you think this can make the difference, the number of seats?
It can make a difference because, again, you use the national legislature as an example. One of the things that was done after 2002, when the PNM were re-elected to government, was to avoid the even deadlock that had happened the year before. They changed the constitution, they changed the number of seats in the national parliament, so you now have an odd number. Now, that can work in Tobago by bringing in an odd number. But whenever you do that, what you are effectively saying is that, look, it's not possible for the people under the current system to come to a political resolution, either through the ballot or through power sharing. And because of that, we are now going to impose on you a new structure. And when you bear in mind that the present system has worked since the Tobago House of Assembly came into being, again, we're talking a major change which ought not to be done so swiftly. And if, as Dr. Dylan Remy says, that this is a test, if you like, of the future of self-governance for Tobago, then they should be given a longer opportunity to consider this. Because what if, where we are seeing the emergence of third parties in Trinidad and Tobago, and possibly even in the future with young people focusing more, for example, on the issue of the environment. They may say, well, look, I'm not satisfied with these parties. I want to form my own. What if you end up in a situation where two parties get even numbers of seats and the third party takes the rest? You end up in the same situation you're in, where you have to speak to each other and reach some sort of compromise. And so this is why I say it's premature, I think, right now, to impose that on Tobago. Perhaps a little more time is necessary.
Right, and we saw the Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Keith Rowley, meeting with the 12 assemblymen and asking them to sit down at the table and to see if they could come up with a solution. That was always his first suggestion, that the people of Tobago should sort themselves out. But after going to the House on at least 3 occasions, somehow they weren't even able to agree on a presiding officer. But QC, something I'm very curious about. One of the things that I always wondered about is these assemblymen who went to the polls, if they should have been sworn in, considering that we already knew it was 6-6 and that this would have resulted in a deadlock. Should they have been sworn in? Because now we're in a quandary, if you ask me, where you have the old assemblymen who are making decisions on behalf of Tobago still, and these new assemblymen who can't move.
Yeah. Well, I think the legislation, the Tobago House of Assembly legislation, really prescribes that, because one of the first things that has to happen is you have to swear in the assemblyman. I mean, when you actually use the phrase assemblyman, you can see how dated the legislation is. It should be assembly member. But maybe that is something that will happen with future legislation. But the point is, I think that the process can only begin if you swear in the membership. That is what the legislation provides for. That is what has happened. And then you move to the next stage of trying to elect the chief secretary, presiding officer.
Right, but QC, the law allows for the old assemblymen, because it's that the THA cannot be without leadership. That's just how the law is as well. So should these older members, old assemblymen, even though the THA was dissolved, even though there was an election, should they be allowed to be making decisions for and on behalf of the people of Tobago?
Well, arguably no, but the business of executive administration cannot stop simply because you haven't been able to rectify the situation in the local parliament. And again, we go back to what happened in Trinidad and Tobago when there was a hung parliament in 2001. And the president at that time appointed Patrick Manning as prime minister, etc. And so the business of governance went on. You had to have people holding those positions. But what you were not able to do was to elect a speaker. And that unsatisfactory situation continued. But in a sense, Natalie, you have to ask yourself, if somebody is not dealing with the day-to-day matters of administration, should this inability to elect a chief secretary, presiding officer, etc., should that stop the business of governance? And since the People's National Movement are the incumbent, arguably they should continue in power until there is a further election. Indeed, the same arguments were made in 2001 when the United National Congress was the incumbent government, which is why there was such a shock in many respects when the president appointed the then leader of the opposition.
Queen's Counsel, we are out of time. My final question to you. Do you believe that this is a threat to democracy if you have a position where the older assemblymen are still in a position to treat with the day-to-day business of Tobago, even though an election was called and there are new assemblymen in place?
No, I don't agree that democracy is under threat. I think that everything we're seeing, including what you mentioned very recently, that there has been this offer by the PDP to the PNM for a compromise, shows democracy in action. A clear distinction should be drawn between the machinery, the legislation, on the one hand, and the ability of people to cooperate. The latter is democracy. The former is a means to that democracy.
All right, Queen's Counsel, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us this morning.
Thank you very much. Take care, Natalie.
Yes, you too. Queen's Counsel Anand Beharrylal, Trinbagonian, operating out of England. And he says, you know, it's premature to go back to the polls, that he believes that they should stay at the table and try to work out a way for the people who have been elected, the 6-6, to come to an agreement to lead the people of Tobago. We take a break and we'll be back with you.